Hi, this evening I want to speak about um, some other aspects of the broad reform movements that had their bearing on the Devadasi and were working to destroy the Devadasi system at that time. I'm speaking now about the period in the early 1900s when the Nautch movement was already quite advanced. And I'm speaking specifically about an essay on the anti-nautch movement written by Mr. Venkataratnam Naidu and published in a tome on social reform in 1901, a tome that was edited by um, Mr. C.Y. Chintamani. But to return to Mr. Naidu himself, I'll just give some brief biographical details. He was quite an intellectual. He was a learned man, very imbued with Western cultural tropes. He shows himself familiar with Western writers on society, such as Carlyle and Ruskin. He quotes Shakespeare. He alludes to John Milton. So he is educated in the Western way to a very high degree. In fact, at the time that he was writing the essay on the anti-nautch movement, he was already the headmaster of the Mehboob College in Secunderabad. Later in life, he would become Vice Chancellor of the Madras University, and even later, he would be knighted. He would become Sir Venkataratnam Naidu. That's a distinguished life. At the time of his writing, though, he was Mr. Naidu, and for the remainder of this talk, I'll be referring to him as Mr. Naidu. Now, Mr. Naidu shows us the fundamentalist mentality of the reformist movements that were gathered together against the Nautch school, the Devadasi. And I want to make clear in this talk that I am not only thinking of the reform movement as an entity existing in India among such groups as the Brahmo Samaj, of which Mr. Naidu was a member. The Brahmo movement, as most will know, was something begun in the 1830s in Calcutta. It made its way southward, and it was a kind of spiritualizing new take on Hinduism that had absorbed many elements of other religions, including Unitarianism. It was, to my mind, a radical form of Hinduism that I think in the reformist atmosphere could give rise to fundamentalist attitudes. And I do see in Mr. Naidu strong evidence of fundamentalism. As I see also in the many Western instances, missionary societies and individuals from those societies working both inside and outside of India to destroy the Devadasi tradition. I see radicalism and fundamentalism in all of them. And the keynote of that kind of fundamentalism is that justice and righteousness will not be served until the entire world or the entire society comes to see things and to behave in ways that are satisfactory to the fundamentalists. In other words, a pipe dream. You know, we have it in the world today as well. It's a pipe dream. Mr. Naidu, although he was very intelligent and a very learned man, was unfortunately also committed to a pipe dream. And his essay is interesting in that it reveals certain ways of seeing the Devadasi and of strategizing in order to overthrow her that we don't readily find in other writings. And I just want to move on immediately to the substance of the essay itself so that we can highlight some of the points that make me believe that the obloquy and the censure that was directed against the Devadasi at that time, speaking now about the early 1900s, stemmed from minds that were so fundamentalist that even normal human behavior, the behavior of the average human being with its failures and weaknesses, was seen as something that needed to be rooted out of society. Never mind factors like alternative sexualities and alternative conjugal lifestyles and so on. Now, Mr. Naidu gives us an interesting insight right at the beginning of his essay in that he tells us that nothing is too commonplace or too personal to be attended to be intervened into by reformist associations or movements. And in this he echoes Rousseau in The Social Contract, whose view then, prior to the French Revolution, was that the legislator should be a person who can change human nature. Mr. Naidu, like the Christian fundamentalists who were also busying themselves with the Devadasi system, was willing to experiment with ways of changing human nature. That becomes very apparent from a full reading of the essay. People as they are really don't measure up to his high standards. And he tells us then that the aim is purity, social purity, which in his mind is synonymous with chastity. There is therefore, throughout the essay, a resounding anxiety and repugnance when it comes to the idea of sexuality, even very normal sexuality. One feels there is a problem. And the Devadasi dances, in his view, are the major corrupting force, not because they're the worst piece of immorality in the society of his time, but because they lie on the borderline between what is, in his view, licit and what is illicit. He criticizes Hindu poetry, and he criticizes the temple lyrics for being seductive and amorous, and he would like to see that changed. And he tells us that in a country where the current faith formulates itself into a seductive order of amorous poetry, it is unavoidable as a beginning that the purity movement was started in the concrete form of the anti-nautch agitation. There you have it. It was, to his mind, necessary to concretize the many invisible evils of India in the sign and body of the Devadasi. He complains that many people feel that he is on the wrong track. Many people feel that he's going after trifles, to put it in his own words. But he feels justified in doing so because, as he also tells us, no man can become a moral being so long as he is able to watch the dance. So long as he is able to attend performances of the nautch, it will be impossible to purify him. That he tells us. And the dances that he is referring to are not street dances or uh, popular dances of lewdness or fun, which probably existed at the time, danced by street dancers. But he's referring to the temple tradition, the court tradition of dance, which is the Tanjore tradition, which was, of course, predominant in South India. He is himself from Andhra, later moved to Madras, so he's concerned with dance in South India. So he's concerned with the lewdness and demoralizing forces that emanate from such items as the Varnam, the Padam, the Javali, the Kriti. These trouble him tremendously. What troubles him also is that the art of music is being held, in his view, hostage or captive by a degraded class. It seems to him a great pity that music at least cannot be handed over to respectable people because it is in the hands of this degraded class, i.e., the male members of the Melakaran community. And he makes no bones about them. In fact, he's one of the few among the reformers writing on the nautch that actually takes the male members into account. Although when he does speak of them, he refers to them as drones and parasites. I suppose what he means by that on the one hand is that they earn a large part of their own living from the remuneration received by the dancers who are trained by them. But on the other hand, I think he also simply means that they are drones and parasites because, in his view, they contribute nothing of any value to society. Because Mr. Naidu clearly does not see the Tanjore Sadhu tradition as being an art that is of any value to the society of his time. He is concerned, we have to give it to him, he is concerned with rescuing music from the hands of this degraded community. But when it comes to dance, Mr. Naidu is uncompromising. Mr. Naidu tells us that dance will have to become obsolete. He informs us that it's unsuitable for India. And he concludes his prophesying about the outcome, the good outcome of the social reform movements by predicting of dance that it will become a relic of the past, to use again his own words. And it has to become a relic of the past because, as he says, as long as the nautch is fashionable among us, it is impossible that the morality of men should improve. Now, there is a call as well for men, especially men in positions of authority, in official positions, in visible positions, to boycott the dance performances. And then he moves on to a consideration of what will happen to the members of the Melakaran community once they've been completely deprived of their art that has been nurtured over many centuries. And he tells us that as to the particular community concerned, he means the music and dance community, when deprived of the prestige of music, which it doesn't deserve, its hope will be chiefly in two healthy changes. One, the allotment of temple service only to the chaste. So he's looking back to a time when the Vestal Virgins were, officiating, doing the Devadasi work in the temples of India. He's looking back to a fictitious era, and he is seeing that it will be established. So once this particular generation of Devadasis has been wiped out, there will be purity, chastity in the temples. That's the first thing. And then, secondly, the education and improvement of the male members of the community. Now, as I've said before, mostly drones and parasites. He goes on to conclude, no doubt for many of the women, namely the dancers, the change will be for a time a vision of Mirza Bridge through which she will drop into the current below. What's this vision of Mirza Bridge? Well, it's an allusion to a piece of writing by Addison, who claims to have picked it up in Cairo. The Mirza Bridge is a vision of a prophet a seer called Mirza, who metaphorically envisaged human life as people walking across this bridge, and there's a torrent of water flowing beneath it, a raging river. And the bridge is full of trapdoors, so as people walk across the bridge, they fall through the trapdoors without knowing it. They're walking along, having fun, engaged in one or another form of jollity, and whoops, suddenly they fall through the trapdoor into the raging torrent. So this is what he foresees for the dancers of his generation, that they will walk across the Mirza Bridge and simply fall through the trapdoor into the raging torrent below. There's no other thought taken by Mr. Naidu for their future. What he foresees is that they are going to enter a life of suffering, and he concludes that that is just inevitable, and that these kinds of sacrifices will have to be made by that community for the betterment of society. So I think that when one approaches this kind of document, one is being neither more nor less than fair in concluding that we really are dealing with a fundamentalist mindset, and a mindset, therefore, about which we have to be very cautious about when trying to assess the veracity of the immorality that it imputes to the Devadasi and to the dance community as a whole. In fact, I would say that the kind of society that Mr. Naidu envisages is not one in which I would care to live.